The contract sat between them like a living thing, its ink still wet enough to smudge if she dared touch it. Elara's fingers hovered above the parchment, trembling in a way that made her furious with herself. She'd survived worse than this. She'd buried her parents in frozen ground with her own hands. She'd walked 3 days through winter forest to reach this God's forsaken territory. She'd stood before the council of elders and begged, actually begged, for sanctuary. And now, after all of that, her survival hinged on a single signature. "It's temporary," she heard herself say, though the words tasted like ash. 6 months, that's all. Across the table, Kael Thorne didn't move. He sat with the stillness of a predator who knew the prey was already caught, his massive frame filling the chair in a way that made the study feel smaller than it was. The firelight cast shadows across his face, illuminating the sharp angles of his jaw, the brutal line of his nose, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow like a declaration of violence survived. He was terrifying. That was Elara's first thought when they'd brought her before him 2 hours ago. Not handsome, though he was, in the way that cliffs are beautiful before you fall from them, but terrifying in his absolute presence, in the way the air itself seemed to bend around him. 6 months, he agreed, his voice low and rough, like gravel scraped across stone. "Long enough to convince the council that our union is legitimate. Long enough to secure your safety from the trackers hunting you." Elara's chest tightened at the mention of the trackers. She could still smell the smoke from her village, still hear the screams as the rival pack had torn through homes looking for her. They'd called her an abomination, said her bloodline was cursed, said she carried a taint that would poison any pack foolish enough to harbor her. The Thorn pack had been her last option, and Kael, its alpha, had offered her a deal she couldn't comprehend but couldn't refuse. A fake marriage, a public binding that would place her under his protection, make her untouchable by pack law. In return, she would play the role of his mate, attend his councils, stand at his side during the challenges that came with leading the largest shifter territory in the northern provinces. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. So why did her skin prickle every time his eyes found hers? "And after 6 months?" Elara forced herself to meet his gaze, though it felt like staring into the heart of a winter storm. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they pinned her in place with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe properly. "After 6 months, we dissolved the arrangement." Kael's fingers drummed once against the armrest of his chair, the only sign of movement he'd made in minutes. "The council will have accepted you. The trackers will have moved on. You'll be free to go wherever you wish." Freedom. The word should have filled her with relief. Instead, it sat heavy in her stomach like a stone. She reached for the quill, her hand steadier now. The nib scratched across parchment as she signed her name in careful, deliberate strokes. Elara Ashwood, the last of her bloodline. The girl who'd agreed to marry an alpha she didn't know to escape a death she'd done nothing to deserve. When she set the quill down, Kael rose from his chair. The movement was liquid and precise, and suddenly the space between them evaporated. He crossed to her side of the table in 3 strides, each one measured and purposeful, and Elara found herself tilting her head back to maintain eye contact. He was taller than she'd realized, tall enough that she barely reached his shoulder, tall enough that when he leaned down, his breath ghosted across her temple. "One more thing," he said softly, and the quietness of his voice was somehow more frightening than if he'd shouted. "For this to work, the bond must appear real. That means proximity. That means touch. That means... He paused. And she felt rather than saw the way his gaze traveled down to her mouth and back up again. Convincing intimacy. Ilara's pulse hammered in her throat. I understand. Do you? His hand lifted, and for one heart-stopping moment she thought he might touch her face. Instead, his fingers hovered just beside her cheek, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. Because if you flinch every time I'm near you, if you freeze when I touch you, they'll know. And if they know, the marriage is void, which means you're no longer under my protection. I won't flinch, she whispered, though her body was screaming at her to step back, to put distance between herself and this male who smelled like pine smoke and something darker, something that made her hindbrain howl warnings she didn't understand. Prove it. Before she could process the command, his hand closed around her wrist. The touch was firm, but not painful, his fingers circling the delicate bones with a gentleness that contradicted everything about him. But it was the sensation that followed that stole the air from her lungs, a heat that spread from the point of contact up her arm, across her chest, pooling low in her belly like molten gold. Her skin felt too tight, her heart felt too fast, and beneath it all was a pull, a magnetic inevitability that terrified her more than the trackers ever had. What was this? Kael's eyes darkened, the pale gray bleeding into something richer, something almost golden. His grip on her wrist tightened fractionally, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to a register that vibrated through her bones. Interesting. Then he released her and stepped back, his expression smoothing into unreadable calm once more. Ilara stood frozen, her wrist burning where he'd touched her, her mind reeling with questions she didn't dare ask. The ceremony is tomorrow at dawn, Kael said, already moving toward the door. My sister will prepare you. Don't be late. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. Only then did Ilara allow herself to sink into the chair he'd vacated, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. She pressed her hand over her racing heart, trying to slow its panicked rhythm, trying to convince herself that what she'd felt was nothing. Fear, exhaustion, stress. Anything but recognition. Because if her body had recognized him, if some primal, buried part of her had responded to his touch the way a mate responds to a mate, then this arrangement was already doomed. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach twist with something that might have been dread or might have been anticipation, was simple. She wasn't sure Kael had been surprised at all. Dawn came too quickly and not quickly enough. Ilara had spent the night in a guest chamber that was larger than the entire cottage she'd grown up in, staring at carved wooden beams that held up a ceiling she couldn't see in the darkness. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd felt the phantom burn of Kael's fingers around her wrist, that inexplicable heat that had spread through her body like wildfire, catching dry timber. She'd tried to rationalize it, tried to convince herself it was nothing more than the stress of her situation manifesting in physical symptoms. But her wolf, the part of her that had always been quiet, almost dormant compared to other shifters, had stirred for the first time in months, padding restlessly beneath her skin, as if recognizing something Ilara's conscious mind refused to acknowledge. Now, as pale light filtered through the narrow windows, a knock came at her door. Kael's sister entered without waiting for permission. Lyra Thorne was everything Ilara wasn't: tall, confident, with hair like spun copper and eyes that assessed everything they touched with razor-sharp precision. She carried an armload of fabric that shimmered even in the dim morning light. "You look terrible," Lyra announced, setting the bundle on the bed. "Didn't sleep?" "I slept fine," Alara lied, rising from the chair where she'd been curled like a wounded animal. Lyra's mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're a terrible liar. Good. My brother can't stand dishonesty." She shook out the fabric, revealing a dress that made Alara's breath catch. It was the color of moonlight on water, silver-gray silk that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. "This was our mother's. Kael wants you to wear it." Alara's fingers trembled as she reached for the dress. The silk was cool against her skin, whispering secrets in a language she didn't speak. "It's beautiful." "It's a message," Lyra corrected, her voice sharp as she helped Alara out of her worn travel clothes. "Every pack within 100 miles will be watching this ceremony. They need to see that Kael has chosen a mate worthy of his station, not some half-starved refugee who stumbled in from the cold." The words stung, but they weren't wrong. Alara looked at her reflection in the brass mirror and barely recognized herself, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, her dark hair tangled and lifeless, her eyes too large in her pale face. "I know what I look like," Alara said quietly. Something shifted in Lyra's expression, a crack in her armor of contempt. She began working on Alara's hair with surprising gentleness, her fingers nimble as they wove complicated braids. "My brother doesn't do anything without reason. If he's chosen to protect you, there's a purpose to it. I suggest you don't make him regret the decision." "I don't understand why he's doing this," Alara admitted, watching Lyra's reflection rather than her own. "He doesn't know me. I'm nothing to him. Why offer a fake marriage when he could have just let the council grant me asylum?" Lyra's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before continuing their work. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "My brother has been Alpha for 7 years. In that time, every eligible female in the territory has tried to claim him, to force a bond, to manipulate their way into his bed. He's rejected them all." She met Alara's eyes in the mirror. Perhaps he thought a temporary arrangement with someone who wants nothing from him was preferable to the alternative. It made sense. It did. So why did it feel like Lyra was lying by omission? The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, a cavernous space that smelled of old wood and older magic. Alara stood at the entrance, Lyra at her side, and felt the weight of 100 stairs land on her like physical blows. The assembled pack filled the hall. Warriors with scars mapping their faces, elders with eyes that had seen centuries, young wolves who watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. And at the center of it all, standing before the ancient altar carved from a single massive stone, was Kael. He wore black from throat to boots, severe and unadorned, except for the silver chain of office that marked him as Alpha. His hair was tied back from his face, revealing the brutal architecture of his features in unforgiving detail. When his eyes found hers across the distance, something in Alara's chest pulled tight, a thread she hadn't known existed suddenly drawn taut. She forced herself to walk forward, each step measured and deliberate, refusing to let them see her fear. The pack parted for her like water around a stone, their whispers following her progress like the hiss of serpents. Too thin. Where did he find her? I heard she's cursed. This won't last. Alara kept her eyes fixed on Kael, using his steady gaze as an anchor against the tide of judgment threatening to drown her. When she finally reached the altar, he extended his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers long and strong as they closed around hers. The heat she'd felt last night blazed to life again, more intense this time, spreading from their joined hands up her arm and across her chest, until she felt like her skin might crack open from the pressure. Kael's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The only sign he felt it too. The ceremony was old, older than language. The elder who presided over it spoke in the ancient tongue, words that rumbled through the hall like distant thunder. Elara didn't understand most of it, but she understood the intent. Binding, claiming, belonging. When the elder drew a ceremonial blade across his palm, then offered it to Kael, Elara's heart began to race. Kael took the blade without flinching, dragged it across his own palm in one smooth motion. Blood welled, dark and rich, and the scent of it hit Elara like a drug. Pine and iron and something wild that made her wolf rise to the surface of her consciousness for the first time in her life. Then Kael turned to her, the blade extended. "Your hand?" he said softly, just for her. Elara's fingers shook as she placed her palm in his. The blade bit, sharp and clean, and her blood mixed with his where their hands pressed together. The elder began chanting, binding their joined hands with a cord woven from silver thread and something that looked like hair. And that's when the world caught fire. Pain exploded through Elara's body, white-hot and all-consuming. But beneath the pain was something else, pleasure so intense it bordered on agony, a connection forging itself between her and Kael with the inevitability of a river carving through stone. She felt him, actually felt him, his shock mirroring hers, his power crashing against her defenses like waves against a cliff. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was fake. This was... Kael's free hand caught her waist as her knees buckled, holding her upright with a strength that should have frightened her. His eyes had gone completely gold, no trace of gray remaining, and when he leaned close enough that his breath stirred her hair, his voice was barely human. "What are you?" Before she could answer, before she could even process the question, the doors to the great hall exploded inward. Armed men poured through, their weapons gleaming, their faces hidden behind masks that marked them as belonging to the Covenant. The hunters who'd destroyed her village, who'd tracked her across 3 territories, who'd sworn to see her dead before the next full moon. And the man leading them looked directly at Elara with eyes full of righteous fury. "There!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the sudden chaos. "The abomination! Seize her!" The world slowed to the pace of honey dripping from a spoon. Elara watched the hunters advance, their boots striking the stone floor in a rhythm that matched her thundering heart, and felt something inside her crack open like an egg, revealing what had been growing in darkness all along. Power, raw, and unfamiliar, and absolutely terrifying. She didn't have time to understand it, didn't have time to question why the air around her hands had begun to shimmer with heat that had nothing to do with the blood bond still burning through her veins. Because Kael moved, and when he moved, reality itself seemed to bend around him. One moment, he was beside her, his hand still gripping her waist. The next, he was between her and the hunters, his body a wall of muscle and lethal intent. The sound that tore from his throat wasn't human. It was the roar of a wolf given voice through a man's mouth. And it shook the rafters of the great hall, hard enough to rain dust down on the assembled pack. You dare. Kael's voice was barely recognizable, scraped raw with fury that made the temperature in the hall plummet. You dare enter my territory, interrupt a sacred ceremony, and threaten what is mine. The lead hunter faltered, his hand tightening on his sword. Behind his mask, Ilara could see his eyes widen as he took in the full measure of what he'd challenged. But he didn't retreat. Men like him never did. They believed too deeply in their righteousness to recognize suicide when it stood before them. The girl is an abomination, the hunter declared, his voice carrying the fervent pitch of fanaticism. She carries bloodlines that should have been cleansed generations ago. The covenant has marked her for purification. And no alpha's protection can... He didn't finish the sentence. Kael was on him before Ilara's mind could process the movement, crossing the distance between them in a blur of speed that defied human capability. His hand closed around the hunter's throat, lifting him off his feet as easily as a child might lift a doll. The other hunters surged forward, weapons raised, but Kael's pack was already moving to intercept them. The great hall erupted into chaos. Steel rang against claw. Bodies collided with brutal force. Screams echoed off ancient stone. And through it all, Ilara stood frozen at the altar, her palms still bleeding from the ceremonial cut, watching Kael defend her with a violence that should have horrified her. It didn't. Instead, something primal in her recognized the display for what it was. Protection. Claiming. A promise written in blood and fury that anyone who touched her would answer to him. Her wolf surged beneath her skin, demanding to be let out, demanding to fight alongside him. But Ilara had never fully shifted, had never been able to complete the transformation that came so easily to other wolves. Her bloodline was diluted, corrupted, broken. Everyone had told her so. So why did power crackle along her fingertips like lightning seeking ground? A hunter broke through the defensive line, his eyes locked on Ilara with single-minded determination. He raised his crossbow, the bolt already nocked, and aimed at her heart. Time crystallized. She saw the tension in his finger as it began to squeeze the trigger, saw the bolt leave the string, saw her death flying toward her at a speed she couldn't possibly dodge. And something inside her said, "No." Heat exploded from her palms, not fire, but something close to it, something that shimmered the air and bent light around itself. The bolt disintegrated mid-flight, reduced to ash that scattered like snow across the stone floor. The hunter stumbled backward, his weapon clattering from his hands, his face gone pale behind his mask. The fighting stopped. Every eye in the hall turned to Ilara, who stood with her hands outstretched, smoke rising from her palms, her breath coming in short gasps as she stared at what she'd done. What she'd done? Impossible. She was weak. She was broken. She was... Kael was suddenly there, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted the blood splattered across his knuckles. His eyes searched hers, still that impossible gold. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been awe. "I knew it," he breathed. "From the moment I touched you, I knew you weren't what you claimed to be." "I don't understand," Ilara whispered, her voice breaking. "I've never been able to. I can't even shift properly." "Because you're not just wolf." Kael's thumb traced her cheekbone, and the simple touch sent sparks racing down her spine. "What else are you, Ilara?" What bloodline are they so desperate to destroy? She didn't know. That was the terrible truth. She'd never known why the Covenant wanted her dead, why her parents had kept her isolated, why her wolf had always felt incomplete. She'd assumed she was simply defective, a genetic mistake that shamed her lineage, but the power still humming through her veins, making her skin glow faintly in the dim light of the hall, suggested otherwise. The lead hunter, still dangling from Kael's earlier grip, though he'd been dropped when Kael moved to Alara, coughed and struggled to his knees. Blood ran from his mouth, but his eyes burned with undiminished conviction. "She's Nephilim touched," he rasped, the words falling like stones into sudden silence. "Angel-blooded, an affront to the natural order, and if you've bound yourself to her, Alpha Thorn, then you've signed your own death warrant alongside hers." The temperature in the hall dropped another 10 degrees. Kael's hand fell from Ilara's face, but only so he could reach for hers, lacing their fingers together with deliberate care. When he turned to face his pack, his assembled warriors and elders who watched with expressions ranging from shock to calculation, his voice carried the absolute authority of a male who had never been challenged and survived to regret it. "Let me be clear," he said softly, and somehow the quietness made his words more terrifying than if he'd shouted them. "As of this moment, Ilara Ashwood is my mate, my Luna, and anyone, pack or covenant or gods themselves, who seeks to harm her will answer to me." He looked down at their joined hands, at the blood still mixing where their palms pressed together, at the silver cord the elder had used to bind them. "The bond is real," he continued, almost to himself. "I felt it form, which means this marriage was never fake at all." Ilara's world tilted on its axis. He felt it too, the impossible pull. The recognition that had blazed between them the moment they'd touched. This wasn't supposed to be real. It was a business arrangement, a temporary solution, Kael's eyes met hers, and what she saw in their golden depths made her forget how to breathe. "We need to talk," he said. "Privately. Now." Kael's private chambers were nothing like Ilara had expected. She'd imagined something austere and cold, a reflection of the Alpha himself, but instead she found herself in a space that spoke of quiet solitude and unexpected warmth. Books lined shelves carved into stone walls. A fire burned low in a massive hearth. Windows overlooked the forest that stretched endlessly toward mountains she couldn't name. He released her hand the moment the door closed behind them, and the absence of his touch felt like loss. Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how the ceremonial dress clung to her frame, how her hair had come loose from Lyra's careful braids during the chaos in the great hall. She could still smell blood, the hunter's, Kael's, her own. And beneath it all was that scent she'd noticed the first time they'd met, the one that made her wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. Pine and winter and something darker, something that called to her. Kael moved to the window, putting distance between them that felt both necessary and unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, stripped of the fury that had shaken the rafters earlier. "Tell me everything you know about your bloodline." Ilara's laugh was bitter and broken. "There's nothing to tell. My parents never spoke of it. I barely remember them. They died when I was 8, and the pack that took me in made it clear I was less than defective. My wolf wouldn't come fully, couldn't shift properly. I assumed I was just weak." You're not weak. Kael turned from the window, and the intensity in his eyes made her take an involuntary step backward. What you did in that hall, disintegrating a crossbow bolt mid-flight, that's not wolf magic. That's something else entirely. The hunter called me Nephilim touched. Elara forced the words out, though speaking them felt like admitting to a crime she hadn't known she'd committed. What does that mean? Kael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze traveling over her as if seeing her for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. Old bloodlines, ancient ones. Before shifters and vampires divided into separate species, there were others. Beings who could walk between worlds, who carried the blood of celestial entities mixed with mortal flesh. Most of those lines died out centuries ago, hunted to extinction by humans who feared what they couldn't understand. But not all of them, Elara whispered, understanding dawning like cold water over heated skin. Not all of them. Kael took a step toward her, then stopped himself, his hands curling into fists at his sides. If you carry that bloodline, even diluted through generations, it explains why the Covenant is so desperate to kill you. They believe angel-touched beings are abominations, proof that the natural order has been corrupted. Elara's legs felt suddenly unsteady. She sank into the chair nearest the fire, pressing her palms against her knees to stop their shaking. So I'm cursed, just like they always said. You're not cursed. The words came out sharp, almost angry. Kael crossed to her in 3 long strides, crouching down so they were eye level, so close she could see the flecks of silver returning to his golden irises. You're powerful. There's a difference. His proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that intoxicating scent that made rational thought difficult. Her fingers itched to reach for him, to test whether his skin would burn against hers the way it had when they'd touched before. She curled her hands into fists instead. Why did you really offer me this arrangement? The question escaped before she could stop it. You said it was to avoid the females in your pack trying to claim you, but that's not the whole truth, is it? Something flickered across Kael's face. Surprise, maybe? Or respect. He rose to his feet, turning away from her, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral again. I've been alpha for 7 years. In that time, I've refused every attempt at a mate bond because I've always known that my true mate was out there somewhere, that I would recognize them when we met. He paused, his shoulders tense beneath the black fabric of his ceremonial coat. 3 days ago, I felt you cross into my territory. Felt it like a hook in my chest, pulling me towards something I couldn't name. When they brought you before me, when I first saw your face. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. So you knew, even before we touched, you knew I was your mate. I suspected. Kael's hands gripped the windowsill hard enough that she heard wood creak. But I hoped, that if I kept the arrangement temporary, if I maintained distance, I could control it, could let you go when the 6 months ended. And now? He turned to face her, and the raw hunger in his expression stole the breath from her lungs. Now the bond is sealed. The moment our blood mixed, the moment that connection formed. His voice dropped to something rough and primal. There's no going back, Elara. You're mine, and God's help me, I'm yours. The words should have frightened her, should have made her run, because she'd agreed to a fake marriage, not a real bond, not a connection that would tie her to this male for the rest of her life. But instead, heat bloomed in her chest, spreading through her veins like wildfire. "I don't understand this," she whispered. "I don't understand what I'm feeling." Kael moved toward her slowly, like approaching a spooked animal. When he reached her chair, he knelt again, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "The mate bond," he said softly, "is the most powerful magic our kind possesses. It ties two souls together, makes them stronger together than apart. But it's also dangerous. If one half of a bonded pair dies, the other rarely survives the loss. So we're trapped." "No." His thumb traced circles on her palm, and even that simple touch sent sparks racing up her arm. "We're chosen. By fate, by biology, by whatever gods still watch over our kind. The question is whether we accept it." Elara looked down at their joined hands, at the dried blood that still marked where they'd been bound during the ceremony. She thought about the power that had exploded from her palms, the way Kael had defended her without hesitation, the rightness she felt when he was near despite every logical reason to be terrified. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What if the covenant is right and I'm just—" The door to Kael's chambers burst open. Lyra stood in the doorway, her face pale, her chest heaving as if she'd run the entire way. "They're coming," she gasped. "The covenant! Not just hunters this time. Their entire Northern Legion. 300 armed men, and they'll be here by nightfall." The War Council convened within the hour, and Elara found herself seated at Kael's right hand in a room full of warriors who looked at her like she was a disease they hadn't yet decided whether to cure or cauterize. The massive oak table bore scars from decades of fists and blades, and the air tasted of tension thick enough to choke on. Lyra stood at the head of the table beside Kael, unfurling a map marked with positions and movements that meant nothing to Elara, but clearly meant everything to the assembled pack. Red marks clustered along the northern border, like a rash spreading toward vital organs. 300 confirmed, Lyra said, her finger tracing the advance. Heavy cavalry, siege equipment, and at least 24 battle mages blessed by their priesthood. They're not here for a skirmish. They're here for extermination. Our numbers? Kael's voice was calm, but Elara could feel the tension radiating from him through the bond that now thrummed between them like a living wire. 200 fighters, if we count everyone capable of holding a weapon, answered a grizzled warrior with a scar bisecting his face from temple to jaw. We have the defensive advantage, the fortress walls, the forest, knowledge of the terrain. But against trained soldiers with siege weapons? He didn't need to finish. The math was simple and brutal. An elder with hair like winter snow spoke up, his voice reedy but carrying undeniable authority. There's an alternative! Give them what they want! The silence that followed was absolute. Elara's blood turned to ice in her veins as every eye in the room turned to her. She didn't need anyone to explain what the elder meant. Give them what they want. Hand her over. One life in exchange for the safety of 200. It was logical. It was practical. It was... No. Kael's voice cut through the room like a blade through silk, soft and absolutely lethal. The next person who suggests abandoning my mate to appease fanatics will find themselves exiled from this pack before the words finish leaving their mouth." The elder's jaw tightened, but he bowed his head in submission. Still, Alara could see the calculation in the eyes around the table, could feel their judgment like weights settling on her shoulders. She was the reason death was coming to their door. She was the reason children would be orphaned and mates would be widowed. She pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against stone loud enough to make several warriors flinch. "I need air," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Kael's hand shot out, catching her wrist. The touch sent that familiar heat racing through her, but beneath it she felt something else, his fear, raw and visceral, bleeding through the bond they shared. "Don't," he said quietly, "just for her. Don't even think about running." "I'm not." She met his eyes, saw the gold bleeding back into silver gray. "I just need to breathe." He studied her for a long moment before releasing her wrist. "Lyra goes with you, and you don't leave the inner courtyard." It wasn't a request. The inner courtyard was a small sanctuary ringed by high walls and ancient trees that somehow grew from stone. Moonlight filtered through leaves just beginning to turn with autumn's approach, dappling the ground in patterns that shifted with every breath of wind. Alara sank onto a stone bench, her legs finally giving out beneath the weight of everything that had happened in the span of a single day. Married, bonded, hunted, powerful. She didn't feel powerful. She felt like a girl who'd been running so long she'd forgotten what it meant to stand still. Lyra settled beside her, close enough for companionship but far enough to respect Ilara's need for space. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. "He's never looked at anyone the way he looks at you," Lyra said finally, her voice stripped of its earlier sharpness. "I've watched females throw themselves at him for years. Beautiful, powerful, politically advantageous females. He rejected them all without a second thought. And then you walk into his territory, half-starved and running from death, and he looks at you like you're the answer to a question he's been asking his whole life." Ilara's throat tightened. "I didn't ask for this, any of this." "None of us ask for our mates." Lyra's smile was sad and knowing. "The bond doesn't care about timing or convenience or whether we're ready. It just is." "You sound like you're speaking from experience." Something shuddered behind Lyra's eyes. "I was. Once. A long time ago." She stood, brushing invisible dust from her trousers. "The point is, my brother would burn this entire territory to ash before he let the Covenant take you. So the question you need to ask yourself isn't whether you're worth protecting. It's whether you're brave enough to fight alongside him." The words hung in the air long after Lyra retreated to give Alara privacy. Was she brave enough? Alara looked down at her hands, at the faint silver scars forming where the ceremonial blade had cut her palm. She thought about the power that had erupted from her when the hunter had aimed that crossbow, the heat that had disintegrated the bolt before it could pierce her heart. She'd spent her entire life believing she was weak, defective, less than everyone around her. What if they'd all been wrong? What if the reason her wolf had never fully emerged was because she was never meant to be just wolf? She closed her eyes and reached inward, past the fear and self-doubt, searching for that spark of heat she'd felt in the great hall. It was there, buried deep but growing stronger with each breath, like embers waiting to be fanned into flame. When she opened her eyes, her palms were glowing with soft silver light. Incredible! Alara spun to find Kael standing in the courtyard entrance, watching her with an expression that made her pulse stutter. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't felt him through the bond, or maybe she had. Maybe that warm pull in her chest was him, had always been him. He crossed to her slowly, his eyes never leaving the light dancing across her skin. When he reached her, he took her hands in his, and where their skin met, the silver glow intensified. "You feel it, don't you?" His voice was rough, intimate. "The way our power recognizes each other. Wolf and angel, shadow and light." "I don't know how to control it," Elara whispered. "I don't even know what it is." "Then we learn together." Kael's hands tightened on hers. "But first, you need to understand something. When I bonded with you, when I claimed you as my mate, it wasn't just about honor or duty. It was because from the moment I saw you, I knew you were the only thing in this world worth protecting, worth dying for." The words stole her breath. "The Covenant is coming," he continued, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "And I won't lie to you. The fight will be brutal. Some of my pack won't survive it. But I need you to know that no matter what happens, no matter how dark it gets, I will not let them take you." Elara's hands trembled in his. "What if I can't control this power? What if I hurt someone? Hurt you?" "You won't. You can't know that." Kael pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, and what she saw in their depths made her forget how to breathe. "I know," he said softly, "because you're mine, and I don't make mistakes about what belongs to me." Then he kissed her. The kiss was nothing like Elara had imagined a first kiss should be. There was no gentle exploration, no tentative testing of boundaries. It was claiming and desperate and absolutely inevitable, like a storm breaking after days of oppressive heat. Kael's mouth moved against hers with a hunger that spoke of restraint finally shattered, and when his hand cupped the back of her neck, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, Elara felt the world narrow to just this. His taste, his scent, the solid warmth of his body against hers. The silver light still glowing from her palms flared brighter, and she felt power surge through the bond between them. Felt Kael's wolf rise to meet her celestial fire with shadow and fang. The combination should have been impossible, should have torn them apart, but instead it wove together like threads on a loom, creating something stronger than either could achieve alone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kael's eyes had gone completely gold again. "That," he said roughly, his thumb tracing her lower lip, "was not part of the plan." Elara's laugh was breathless and slightly unhinged. "We had a plan?" "Stay distant. Keep it professional. Let you go when the 6 months ended." His forehead dropped against hers again, and she could feel him trembling with the effort of not pulling her back into another kiss. Terrible plan. Doomed from the start. She should pull away. Should remind him that just hours ago she'd believed this was fake, that she'd agreed to a business arrangement, not a soul bond that would tie them together for eternity. But her hands had fisted in his shirt without her permission, and the thought of letting go felt like trying to stop breathing. "The Covenant," she started, "will be dealt with." Kael's voice hardened, the alpha bleeding back through the mate who'd just kissed her senseless. "But I need to know you're with me, truly with me. Not just because the bond demands it, but because you choose it." Elara pulled back enough to meet his eyes, to see the vulnerability lurking beneath all that predatory confidence. He was giving her a choice, even now, even though the bond was sealed, and breaking it would destroy them both. "I choose you," she whispered, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "I choose this, whatever comes next." The relief that flooded through the bond was staggering. Kael crushed her against him, burying his face in her hair, and for a moment he was just a male holding his mate. Not an alpha preparing for war. But the moment couldn't last. A howl split the night, the warning call that meant enemies at the border. They were out of time. The next hours blurred together in a chaos of preparation. Alara found herself swept into the undercurrent of a pack preparing for siege, watching warriors sharpen weapons and reinforce walls, while children were hustled into the underground shelters carved from living rock. Lyra had outfitted her in leather armor that fit surprisingly well, explaining tersely that it had belonged to their mother before handing Alara a blade she had no idea how to use. "Point the sharp end at anything that tries to kill you," Lyra said, which was less helpful than she probably intended. Now Alara stood on the fortress walls beside Kael, watching torchlight bloom in the distance like malevolent stars. The Covenant army was larger than she'd imagined, a sea of armed men advancing with the inexorable patience of those who believed God was on their side. "It's not too late," she said quietly. "I could still—" "No." Kael didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. "We've already had this conversation, and the answer will never change. Your pack is going to die because of me. My pack is going to fight because that's what we do." He finally turned to face her, and the fierce pride in his expression made her chest tight. "We don't abandon our own. We don't surrender to bullies who hide behind righteousness. And we sure as hell don't give up our Luna because some fanatics decided she's an abomination." Luna. The word still felt foreign on her tongue, like a title meant for someone else. The Covenant forces stopped just outside arrow range, their ranks organizing with military precision. A figure on horseback rode forward, carrying a white flag that would have been funny if the situation wasn't so deadly. "Alpha Thorn!" the rider called, his voice carrying across the distance. "The Covenant offers you one final chance. Surrender the angel-touched female, and we will withdraw peacefully. Refuse, and we will take her by force. Choose wisely." Kael's laugh was cold enough to frost the air between them. "Here's my counteroffer," he shouted back, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that marked him as Alpha. "Turn around and leave my territory. Do it now, and I'll let you keep your lives. Stay, and I'll paint these walls with your blood." The rider's posture stiffened. "So be it. Her death will be on your conscience, Alpha." "No," Kael said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "Her survival will be my legacy." The rider retreated, and for one breathless moment the world hung suspended between peace and violence. Then the Covenant forces charged. The first wave hit the fortress walls like a tsunami of steel and fury. Arrows darkened the sky. Siege ladders slammed against stone. Battle cries split the air, primal and terrifying. And through it all, Alara stood frozen, watching Kael transform into something beyond human, beyond even wolf, as he led his pack in defense of their home. And her. She saw him tear through enemy soldiers with claws that gleamed like obsidian. Saw him move with impossible speed, each strike calculated and lethal. Saw him protect his pack with a ferocity that spoke of love deeper than duty. She'd never seen anything more beautiful or more terrible. A ladder slammed against the wall section where she stood. Covenant soldiers began climbing, their eyes fixed on her with zealous determination. The pack warriors moved to intercept, but there were too many, coming too fast. One reached the top of the wall. His sword swung toward her neck, and Alara's power exploded outward in a wave of silver fire that sent the soldier screaming backward, his weapon melting in his hands. The ladder collapsed. The soldiers climbing it fell. The battle paused as both sides turned to stare at the girl, wreathed in celestial light, standing on the fortress wall like an avenging angel. Alara looked down at her hands, at the power that no longer felt foreign but intrinsic, and understood with sudden clarity what she was meant to do. She wasn't meant to hide. She was meant to burn. The silver fire pouring from Alara's hands wasn't just light. It was judgment made manifest, searing through the darkness with a purity that made even her allies shield their eyes. She felt it burning through her veins, felt centuries of dormant power finally awakening, and understood, with brutal clarity, why the Covenant had hunted her bloodline to near extinction. They'd been right to fear this. Below her, the Covenant forces stumbled backward, their zealous confidence cracking in the face of something their scriptures had warned them about, but never truly believed existed. A Nephilim ascending. Angel-touched fury unleashed. "Fall back!" Their commander's voice cracked with panic. "Defensive formation! Bring up the mages!" Kael was suddenly beside her, his hand gripping her arm, not to restrain, but to anchor. Through their bond, she felt his shock, his awe, and beneath it all, his unwavering acceptance. "How long can you hold it?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Alara looked down at the silver flames dancing across her skin, felt them feeding on something deep within her that had no bottom she could find. "I don't know. It feels endless." "Then we use it." Kael's eyes blazed gold as he turned to his pack. "Archers, target their mages before they can counter. Infantry, hold the walls. Let them break themselves against our Luna's fire." The battle shifted. What had been a desperate defense became something else entirely as Alara's power formed a barrier that turned arrows to ash and melted siege equipment before it could touch stone. Covenant soldiers who tried to scale the walls found themselves facing not just pack warriors, but celestial fire that burned away their blessed armor like paper. But the Covenant hadn't survived centuries of hunting supernatural beings without learning how to fight magic. Their battle mages formed a circle, chanting in a language that made Alara's bones ache. Dark energy coalesced above them, twisting into something that tasted of corruption and righteous fury merged into perverse unity. She felt it reaching for her power, trying to smother her light with shadow blessed by their god. The two forces collided. Pain exploded through Alara's skull as the mage's counterspell slammed against her shields. She staggered, her vision whiting out, but Kael's arms caught her before she could fall. "I've got you," he breathed against her ear. "Channel it through me. Through our bond. You're not alone in this." Alara didn't understand what he meant until she felt it. His wolf rising to meet her angel fire, shadow and light intertwining just as they had when they kissed. The combination was alchemical, transformative. Her power stopped fighting against itself and instead flowed through the bond, through Kael, and back into her, amplified 100-fold. The silver fire turned to white gold. The Covenant mage's spell shattered, and Alara's power swept across the battlefield like a tidal wave, not killing. She couldn't bring herself to kill, not even enemies who wanted her dead, but burning away weapons, armor, the blessed protections their priests had woven into their flesh. It left them human, vulnerable, mortal. The Covenant army broke. Soldiers fled into the forest, scrambling over their fallen comrades in their desperation to escape the angel-touched girl who'd proven every nightmare their scriptures had promised. Their commander tried to rally them, but fear was a contagion more powerful than faith, and within minutes the organized legion had devolved into scattered groups of terrified men running for their lives. The pack warriors howled victory into the night, but Alara barely heard them. The power was draining from her now, leaving her hollow and trembling. Her knees buckled. Kael caught her, sweeping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "You did it," he said, wonder bleeding through his voice. "You saved us all." Alara managed a weak smile. "We did it. I felt you. In the power. Couldn't have done it without—" Darkness took her before she could finish. She woke in Kael's bed, wrapped in furs that smelled like him. Sunlight streamed through windows she didn't remember, painting the room in shades of gold that hurt her sensitive eyes. Her body felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry, every muscle aching with a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of power expended beyond mortal limits. "Easy," Kael's voice, rough with sleeplessness. He appeared beside the bed, pressing a cup of water to her lips. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. 2? Alara struggled to sit up, panic flaring. "The Covenant?" "Scattered, broken. Their surviving forces retreated beyond our borders, and our scouts report they're still running." His hand cupped her face with infinite gentleness. "You destroyed an army, Alara. Single-handedly turned the tide of a battle we had no right to win." The words should have filled her with pride. Instead, she felt only exhaustion and creeping dread. What does that make me? If I can do that, what am I? Kael's smile was soft and knowing. "You're exactly what you've always been. My mate. My Luna. The woman I choose, regardless of what power runs through her veins." "And your pack? Do they feel the same?" His hesitation told her everything she needed to know. The pack council convened that evening, and this time the tension in the room had nothing to do with external threats. Alara sat beside Kael, acutely aware of the way certain elders refused to meet her eyes while others stared with barely concealed fear. She'd saved them, and they were terrified of her. "The Covenant will return." The same elder who'd suggested surrendering Alara spoke, his voice trembling with age and conviction. "Perhaps not this year, perhaps not the next, but they will return. And when they do, they won't come with soldiers. They'll come with inquisitors and holy fire, and they won't stop until everything we've built is ash." "Then we'll be ready," Kael said flatly. "Will we?" Another elder leaned forward, her scarred hands flat on the table. "Alpha, we respect your choice of mate. We honor the bond. But the power she wields, it's beyond anything our kind has seen in generations. How do we know she can control it? How do we know she won't turn it on us?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Alara felt Kael's fury through the bond, felt him preparing to unleash the full weight of his alpha dominance on anyone who dared question her. But she placed her hand on his arm, stopping him. "You don't," she said quietly, addressing the council directly. "You don't know I can control it because I'm still learning what it is, But I can promise you this. I would die before I let this power hurt anyone in this pack." "Pretty words," the elder muttered. "But words don't—" Silver light flared from Ilara's palm, just a flicker, just enough to make her point. Every person in the room flinched, and she hated that she'd proven their fear justified. Hated that the power meant to protect them had become the thing they feared most. She extinguished the light. "I understand why you're afraid," she continued, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I'm afraid too. But I'm also your Luna, whether you accept me or not. And I will defend this pack with everything I am, even if that means defending you from your own prejudice." Silence fell, thick and uncomfortable. Then Lyra stood, her chair scraping loudly against stone. "My brother chose well," she said, looking directly at the dissenting elders. "And anyone who can't see that is welcome to challenge him for the position of Alpha. Otherwise, this discussion is over." No one moved to challenge. The council dispersed slowly, reluctantly, leaving Ilara and Kael alone in the chamber. She waited until the last footsteps faded before letting her composure crack. "They're right to fear me," she whispered. "I don't know what I am. Don't know how to control this. What if I hurt someone? What if I hurt you?" Kael pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face against his chest, breathing in his scent until her racing heart slowed. "You won't," he said firmly. "And do you want to know how I'm so certain?" "How?" "Because I feel what you feel through this bond. I know your heart, Ilara, and there's not a single dark corner in it." His hand tilted her face up to his. "The power is just a tool. What matters is the person wielding it. And you're the best person I've ever known." The words broke something inside her, some last wall of resistance she'd been maintaining. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Kael kissed them away with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of what I am, of what this means." "Of losing you?" "You won't lose me." His forehead pressed against hers. "I'm yours, remember? Completely, irrevocably, forever." Forever is a long time. Not long enough. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promises that had nothing to do with temporary arrangements or fake marriages. This was real. This was permanent. This was the future she'd never dared imagine. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kael's eyes had gone molten gold. "I need to tell you something," he said roughly. "Something I should have told you before, but I was afraid it would scare you away." Ilara's pulse quickened. "What?" "The bond we share, it's not complete. Not yet." His hands framed her face with infinite care. "There's a final claiming, a bite that marks you as mine permanently, that lets our souls truly merge. Without it, the bond can still be broken. With it, we're bound forever," she finished. "Yes." His thumb traced her lower lip. "I won't force it, won't claim you until you're ready. But Ilara, I need you to know. I want it, want you, want everything this bond offers and more." Heat pooled low in her belly at the hunger in his voice, at the restraint she could feel thrumming through him. He was giving her the choice, even though every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to claim, to mark, to make her irrevocably his. "When?" she whispered. "When does it happen?" "When you ask for it." His smile was sharp and possessive. "When you're ready to be claimed completely." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the courtyard below. Shouts and the clash of steel that meant trouble. They rushed to the window and froze. A woman stood in the courtyard, surrounded by Kael's guards but somehow untouched, as if they couldn't quite bring themselves to strike her. She was beautiful in a cold, perfect way, with hair like spun moonlight and eyes that burned with silver fire. Power radiated from her in waves that made Alara's own celestial fire recognize and respond. "Kael Thorn!" the woman called, her voice carrying impossible authority. "I am Seraphine, emissary of the Celestial Court, and I have come to collect what belongs to us." Her eyes locked on Alara. "The half-blood Nephilim you've bound to yourself is not yours to keep, Alpha. She belongs to her father's people, and we have come to take her home." Alara descended the stairs with Kael at her side, her heart hammering against her ribs. The woman in the courtyard, Seraphine, radiated power that made Alara's own celestial fire feel like a candle beside a bonfire. "You have no claim here," Kael said, his alpha voice making the air vibrate. "Alara is my mate. She stays." Seraphine's laugh was cold and musical. "Your mate? She doesn't even know what she is. Her father was one of the fallen, and her mother stole her away before the court could claim her." Her silver eyes fixed on Alara. "You've been living as a wolf when you should have been trained as one of us." "What does that mean?" Alara asked. "It means you're wasted here." Seraphine extended her hand, power crackling around her fingers. "I can teach you to master your birthright. You could be magnificent. Instead, you've bound yourself to a wolf who can't possibly contain what you're becoming." Kael's hand tightened on Alara's. "She's not going anywhere." "Isn't she?" Seraphine's smile sharpened. "What happens when her power grows beyond your ability to ground it? She destroyed an army 2 days ago. In a year, she could level kingdoms." She looked at Alara directly. "Come with me. Learn what you are. Your father died for loving a mortal. Don't let his sacrifice be wasted." Alara felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Through the bond, she felt Kael's fear, his fury, but beneath it all, trust. He was letting her decide. "You're right," Alara said quietly. "I don't fully understand what I am, but I know who I am." Silver light bloomed from her palms, merging with the bond connecting her to Kael. "My father's blood runs through me, yes. But so does my mother's. She protected me from people who see power as something to be used instead of cherished." The light grew brighter, warming the entire courtyard. "I choose him," Alara continued, looking at Kael. "I choose this pack. If my power grows beyond control, we'll face that together. But I won't abandon the people who've given me a home." Seraphine's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it's mine to make." For a long moment, Seraphine stared at them. Then she inclined her head. Not respect, but acknowledgement. "The court does not forget its own. When your power becomes too much for mortal bonds to contain, we will return. She vanished in a flash of light. The courtyard erupted in relieved chatter, but Elara only had eyes for Kael. The fierce pride and hunger in his gaze made her pulse race. "You chose me," he said roughly. "I chose us." She cupped his face, her decision crystallizing with absolute certainty. "And I'm ready, Kael. Ready for the final claiming." His eyes flared gold. "Once it's done?" "I'm certain." She tilted her head, baring her throat. "Claim me. Make me yours completely." Kael's control shattered. He swept her into his arms and carried her from the courtyard, ignoring the knowing howls from his pack. The journey to his chambers blurred, doors kicked open, furs tumbling around them as he laid her on the bed with trembling reverence. "Last chance," he growled, his body caging hers, teeth already elongating. "Tell me no, and I'll wait forever." "I need you," Elara whispered. "Only you, always you." His mouth found the junction of her neck and shoulder. When his teeth sank into her flesh, the world exploded. Pain and pleasure merged into something transcendent. Their bond, strong before, became absolute. She felt his heartbeat as her own, tasted his emotions as clearly as her thoughts. The claiming mark blazed to life on her skin, silver and gold intertwined. Elara Ashwood became, irrevocably and eternally, Kael Thorne's mate. 3 months later, spring came to the Northern Territories with a gentleness that belied the brutal winter that had preceded it. Elara stood on the balcony of their private chambers, watching the forest transform from skeletal branches to verdant canopy, and marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. The claiming mark on her neck had settled into a permanent reminder of the night everything shifted. Silver and gold threads woven together in a pattern that marked her as Kael's mate to anyone who looked. She traced it absently, feeling the echo of pleasure-pain that accompanied the memory. Feeling Kael's awareness bloom through their bond, even though he was halfway across the fortress in a council meeting. "Missing you," his thought whispered through their connection, clear as spoken words now that the bond was complete. "Liar," she sent back, affection warming the word. "You're negotiating trade agreements and loving every minute of it." His mental laugh wrapped around her like an embrace. "Come to me anyway." She shouldn't. He was alpha, and interrupting pack business was frowned upon. But she was Luna now. Truly, fully Luna, and the pack had learned over the past months that where Kael went, Elara followed, and vice versa. The bond wouldn't allow anything else. The council chamber fell silent when she entered, but it was a comfortable silence now, not the tense fear that had greeted her in those first weeks. The elders had learned that her power, while vast, was controlled. More than controlled. It had become an asset, one that had already repelled 2 more Covenant scouting parties and earned grudging respect from neighboring territories. Kael's eyes found hers across the room, and the heat in them made her pulse quicken despite the audience. He'd been in meetings for hours, and his control was clearly fraying. She could feel his wolf pacing beneath his skin, demanding proximity to his mate. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," Kael announced abruptly, standing with fluid grace. "Unless there are urgent matters that can't wait?" The elders exchanged knowing looks, but wisely said nothing. They'd learned that arguing with an alpha separated from his mate was an exercise in futility. The moment the door closed behind them, Kael's mouth was on hers, kissing her with hunger that 3 months of constant proximity had done nothing to diminish. Elara melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as he backed her against the wall with careful urgency. "Missed you," he growled against her lips, echoing his earlier thought. "You saw me at breakfast." "Too long." His teeth grazed her claiming mark, making her gasp. "Every minute apart is too long." It should have been suffocating. This intensity, this need. Instead, it felt like breathing after a lifetime of holding her breath. She'd spent so many years alone, unwanted, that being desperately desired by someone who knew every corner of her soul and chose her anyway felt like a miracle she'd never take for granted. "I have news," she said breathlessly as his mouth traveled down her neck. Kael paused, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. "Good news, or the Covenant is back news?" "Good news." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock to wonder as understanding dawned. "At least, I think it's good news. The healer confirmed it this morning." "You're—" His voice broke. "We're pregnant." The word felt strange on her tongue, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I know we didn't plan for it to happen so soon. And with everything still so uncertain." Kael crushed her against him, burying his face in her hair as emotions too big for words flooded through their bond. Joy, pride, fear, love so vast it made her chest ache. "Uncertain?" He finally managed, his voice rough. "Elara, you are the only certain thing in my entire existence. This—" His hand spread protectively over her stomach. "This is everything." She felt tears spill down her cheeks, happy and overwhelming. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if the baby inherits my power? What if the Covenant—" "Then we'll teach them to control it, just like you learned." Kael cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "And if the Covenant comes, they'll face not just their Luna, but their future heir. We'll protect this child the way we protect each other, with everything we are." Through the bond, she felt the absolute truth of his words, felt his certainty become hers. That evening, they announced it to the pack during the traditional spring feast. The great hall erupted in celebration, howls of joy, toasts drunk to the future heir, pack members approaching to offer congratulations and touch Elara's stomach with reverence that still felt surreal. Lyra hugged her with fierce affection. A niece or nephew to spoil. Finally. Even the elders who'd once feared Elara now looked at her with something approaching pride. She'd proven herself over these months, not just through power, but through dedication to the pack, through the way she stood beside Kael during every challenge, through the gentleness she showed the young ones and the strength she displayed to their enemies. She was Luna. Not because fate had decreed it, but because she'd chosen it. Because she'd earned it. As the celebration stretched into the night, Kael pulled her onto the balcony for a moment of quiet. The forest stretched before them, dark and alive with spring sounds, and above them stars wheeled in patterns older than memory. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Choosing this life instead of what Seraphine offered?" Elara leaned back against his chest, his arms wrapping around her waist, his hand splaying protectively over where their child grew. Through the bond, she felt his heartbeat, steady and sure, matching her own. "Never," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. This is where I belong, with you, with our pack, with our family. Kael's lips brushed her claiming mark, sending pleasant shivers down her spine. My Luna, he murmured, my mate, my everything. And Elara, who'd spent so many years believing she was broken, defective, unwanted, finally understood the truth. She'd never been any of those things. She'd simply been waiting to find the person who would see her completely and choose her anyway. Waiting to discover that home wasn't a place, but a person whose soul recognized hers. She was chosen, she was loved, she was home, and that was the greatest power of all.